How does a civilization as radiant as Egypt, as calculated as Greek reason, and as ambitious as Ptolemaic rule, choose to destroy itself from within? Before she ever wore the crown, Cleopatra was already a prisoner, not in chains of iron, but in the silent, coiled trap of her own blood. She was not born of a royal lineage. She was born of a genetic echo chamber, a dynasty so obsessed with purity, it married brother to sister, father to daughter, until the branches of its family tree twisted into knots of decay. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, but unlike most dynasties, they did not fear enemies from abroad. Their greatest threat came from their own beds. Starting from Ptolemy II, who married his full sister Arsinoe II. Incest was not a sin in the royal court. It was a strategy, a way to keep divine power locked within the same veins, a way to mimic the god-kings of ancient Egypt and outlast the chaos of the Mediterranean. But blood, when left to circle itself, begins to rot. And by the time Cleopatra emerged, her empire was already limping. Madness had crept into thrones, murders unfolded behind golden doors. And the last queen of Egypt was not standing at the beginning of glory, but at the bitter end of a bloodline too poisoned to survive. So ask yourself this: was Cleopatra ever truly chosen to rule, or was she simply the final flicker of a candle burning from both ends? Because in the Ptolemaic dynasty, power did not come from conquests, wealth, or vision. It came from bedsheets soaked in history, from marriages that defied nature, and from children raised not as heirs to a future, but as vessels of a curse written in chromosomes. You are about to enter a dynasty where power was born not from legacy, but from the collapse of it. This is the throne that incest built, and this is the story of how it fell. Egypt did not fall into the hands of the Ptolemies by divine right. It fell by design. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, his empire fractured like a broken sword. One of his most trusted generals, Ptolemy son of Lagus, seized Egypt not as a gift, but as a calculation. He knew what the others did not. Egypt was not just land. It was myth. It was memory. It was the throne of gods. To hold it, he had to become more than a man. Ptolemy I Soter took the body of Alexander and buried it in Alexandria, turning the city into both a grave and a symbol. Then he crowned himself king, not a satrap, not a servant, a ruler of his own making. But Egypt did not worship kings. It obeyed gods who walked among mortals. Pharaohs were not elected. They were born from eternity. If he wanted to last, he had to become something sacred. He began with symbols. He adopted Egyptian regalia. He allowed temples to flourish. He paid homage to the ancient rites. But one element of the divine tradition remained untouched, the most controversial, the most powerful, the marriage of blood to blood. For centuries, Egyptian pharaohs had married their sisters. It was not scandal, it was scripture. The gods themselves had done so. Isis and Osiris were siblings who ruled as one. Their union produced Horus, the falcon god, protector of pharaohs. Incest among royals was seen as a preservation of divine essence. It kept the power in one line. It bound the throne to heaven. Ptolemy stopped short. He did not marry within his family. His rule still carried the scent of Macedon, but his descendants would go further. They would embrace the imitation completely, not out of faith, but out of fear. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus took the step his father did not. He married his full sister, Arsinoe II, and placed her beside him as queen. They styled themselves as living gods. Temples were built in their honor. Coins bore their likeness. The Greek world recoiled. Incest was an abomination under Hellenic law. But in Egypt, it was a statement of legitimacy. It was the moment when foreign rule merged with ancient custom, not as conquest, but as transformation. With that union, something irreversible began. From then on, the bloodline would be sealed from the outside. No foreign queens would be permitted. No marriage would dilute the royal stream. The heirs of Egypt would be born from the same veins. Brothers would marry sisters. Uncles would take nieces. In some cases, the line between parent and spouse would blur into silence. It was not just a strategy, it became dogma. Each generation tightened the circle. The royal family became its own mirror. They looked inward, seeking purity, fearing betrayal. Outside alliances were no longer desirable. They were dangerous. Outsiders could bring claimants. Outsiders could bring war. But blood, they believed, could be controlled. Blood could be trusted. And so, the throne became a closed loop. To the world beyond, the Ptolemaic court appeared glorious. Alexandria stood as a beacon of culture. Its library drew scholars from every shore. Its port welcomed merchants, poets, philosophers. The dynasty cloaked itself in gold and parchment, in perfume and philosophy. But beneath the splendor, something ancient was decaying. The blood of gods, repeated too often, becomes a cage. The same names returned again and again. Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Arsinoe, Berenice. But the faces grew weaker, the minds more fractured, the ambitions more desperate. Within this sealed family, love turned to jealousy, trust turned to suspicion, brother poisoned brother, sisters plotted against sons, mothers feared their daughters. And yet, the cycle never stopped. The Ptolemies believed they were guarding their throne from the corruption of outsiders. But they had invited another enemy inside, one that crept slowly, silently, through every shared lineage. It was not a soldier. It was not a rebellion. It was inheritance itself. They thought they were becoming gods. In truth, they were building a dynasty that would consume itself from within. What begins as strategy becomes doctrine. What begins as imitation becomes obsession. By the third generation of the Ptolemaic dynasty, sibling marriage was no longer a political tool. It was the law of blood. To marry outside the family was to invite the wrath of gods and the suspicion of court. The throne was no longer defended by armies alone. It was defended by chromosomes repeating themselves behind palace walls. Ptolemy IV, Philopator inherited this legacy like a sacred illness. Born of a royal union between uncle and niece, his blood carried not just divine pretense but a growing genetic burden. At first, his reign promised continuity. He built temples. He offered lavish gifts to the clergy. But beneath the marble and incense, the man himself was unraveling. Ancient sources describe him as gluttonous, erratic, addicted to luxury, and consumed by paranoia. His rule became a shadow play of executions and disappearances. Family members died suddenly. Advisors vanished. Even his own mother may have met her end in silence. He married his sister Arsinoe III, not for love, nor even for power, but because the ritual demanded it. She bore him a son, but the union was brittle. When Ptolemy IV died, palace officials moved swiftly to secure power. Arsinoe III, the mother of the heir, was murdered in her chambers. The child king, Ptolemy V, would ascend the throne under a cloud of blood. Ptolemy VIII, known to history as Physcon, took the sickness further. His body was misshapen, swollen, and mocked by his own people. But it was his cruelty that carved his name into infamy. He married one sister, then another. He took his niece as a lover, then made her queen. He fathered children with multiple female relatives, blending the family tree into something monstrous. His rule was marked by purges, exiles, and the public display of bodies. Citizens were dismembered and thrown into the Nile. Priests were mutilated. Scholars fled. Even his own son was killed before reaching adulthood. Behind these horrors lay a deeper sickness. The dynasty had turned inwards for so long that it had begun to collapse upon itself. There were no new names, no fresh blood, no hope of renewal. Only repetition, the same alliances, the same betrayals, the same blood spilled across the same floors. Each child born into the royal house was both an heir and a liability. They carried the name of Ptolemy or Cleopatra, but behind the name was a mind that might fracture, a heart that might turn against its own kin. Records speak of madness, hallucinations, violent mood swings. These were not just the products of palace pressure. They were symptoms. Repeated unions within the same lineage began to show their toll not only in behavior, but in the body itself. The dynasty, once an empire of the mind with its great library and temples, became an empire of shadows. The court filled with whispers. Assassins wore royal robes. Trust disappeared. Every banquet might be poisoned. Every smile might conceal a dagger. Queens watched their own children with suspicion. Brothers greeted each other like strangers in a foreign land. Even the people outside the palace began to notice. The festivals continued, but they had lost their joy. The monuments grew taller, but the foundations were cracked. The priests kept singing, but fewer believed. The Nile flowed. But Egypt was beginning to feel old. And still, the family continued, each generation narrowing, each union tightening the grip of blood upon itself. The name Cleopatra was not unique. Before the Cleopatra that history remembers, there were many others. Each bore the name like a mantle, passed down like a relic, but each one was also bound to the curse of repetition. Cleopatra married her uncle. Cleopatra II married her brother. Cleopatra III ruled beside her son and then plotted his death. The lines between mother and wife, between heir and threat, blurred into a web that no scholar could fully unravel. Even the chroniclers of the time struggled to make sense of who ruled beside whom, who bore which child, and who ordered which murder. The palace became a maze of whispers. Alliances formed over the span of a single evening, then shattered by mourning. Sisters became queens, then rivals, then enemies. Children were raised to inherit power, only to be slaughtered before they could speak their first command. The same blood flowed through every room of the palace, and that blood was always watching. Over time, The Ptolemaic dynasty became less a royal line and more a ritual. Names were repeated with obsessive precision. Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Arsinoe, again and again. As if by speaking the names often enough, they could conjure a time when the line had been strong. But it was only illusion. The repetition did not preserve power. It concealed the decay. By the final century of their rule, the Ptolemies no longer ruled a kingdom. They ruled the idea of one. Rome had begun its slow encroachment into Egyptian affairs. The Senate sent envoys. Generals arrived under the guise of friendship. Cleopatra Tryphena was poisoned. Berenice was executed. Cleopatra V disappeared from the record entirely. In the face of Roman pressure, the dynasty turned once more to its oldest defense. Incest would keep the throne closed. Blood would bind the crown to the past. But blood cannot save what has already rotted. When Ptolemy I, known to Rome as Aulet, took the throne, he had already inherited a kingdom slipping from his grasp. He was born of incest, possibly between close kin, though records remain unclear. He ruled with fear, with bribes, with music rather than strength. He taxed the temples. He alienated the priests. He fled Egypt when rebellion rose, leaving his daughter to rule in his absence. That daughter was Cleopatra. She would become the most famous name in Egyptian history. But she did not rise from greatness. She rose from a bloodline collapsed under its own weight. She was not the beginning of a legacy. She was the last flower growing from soil long turned to ash. Cleopatra would speak 9 languages. She would charm Caesar and Mark Antony. She would command fleets, raise armies, and write laws. But beneath the silk and the silver, she too was a daughter of the spiral. Born to a father twisted by politics and fear. Born perhaps to a mother whose identity remains shrouded in silence. Born into a family that had not opened its doors to fresh blood for generations. She was brilliant, but she was not free. She had inherited more than a crown. She had inherited the consequences of every union before her. Every decision to keep the bloodline sealed. Every marriage signed in secrecy and silence. Every sibling forced into a bed not of love, but of tradition. She carried all of it in her name. And in her veins. When Cleopatra VII was born around 69 BCE, the dynasty that bore her name was already bleeding from within. The palace still glittered in Alexandria. The priests still chanted her lineage as divine. The statues still depicted her ancestors as gods among mortals. But beneath the stone and gold, the bloodline had withered. What remained was brilliance without balance, tradition without renewal, and a family so entangled in its own history that no one remembered where the curse began. Cleopatra was born to Ptolemy I Auletes, a ruler mocked for his flute playing and ridiculed by his people for his reliance on Roman gold. His reign was marked not by glory, but by desperation. He had purchased the support of Rome at the cost of Egyptian dignity. He had exiled his daughters. He had run from his own kingdom when revolt stirred. His throne was kept afloat not by love, nor fear, but by bribes and broken promises. The identity of Cleopatra's mother remains uncertain. Some historians believe she may have been Cleopatra V Tryphena, possibly a sister or cousin of Ptolemy I. Others suggest she was a concubine of noble blood, but never named in the official record. What is certain is that Cleopatra was born into a house where names repeated like incantations. Her sisters were also named Cleopatra. Her brothers, Ptolemy, each child a shadow of the last, each sibling both kin and rival. When her father died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was named co-ruler alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy I. He was around 10 years old. She was 18. But age did not matter. Neither did ability. What mattered was appearance. A queen could not rule alone. The fiction of shared power had to be maintained. So she was married to him, not in spirit, not in love, but in law. A queen must marry her brother. The tradition had become the trap. From the moment she took power, Cleopatra faced resistance. Not just from her brother's advisors, who feared her intelligence. Not just from Rome, which watched Egypt like a vulture circling a dying lion. Her greatest obstacle was the legacy written into her blood. She was both a symbol of continuity and a reminder of decay. Her name carried authority, but also expectation. She must rule like a goddess. She must marry like a priestess. She must never step beyond the boundaries her ancestors had sealed centuries before. But Cleopatra did not belong to the past. She belonged to something far more dangerous. She belonged to herself. Unlike many of her predecessors, Cleopatra spoke Egyptian. She learned multiple languages, including Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and possibly Latin. She studied philosophy, astronomy, medicine. She listened to priests, but also to merchants. She ruled not from behind a curtain, but from the center of the storm. She did not wait to be rescued. She reached for power with both hands. When tensions with her brother escalated, she was driven from Alexandria. But exile did not break her. It clarified her. While her brother's court collapsed into infighting, Cleopatra crossed the desert to meet Julius Caesar. Their encounter would become legend. But it was not seduction that defined her. It was calculation. She returned to Alexandria with Caesar's support. She defeated her brother's forces. Ptolemy III drowned in the Nile, fleeing the battle. Cleopatra was queen, alone. But Egypt would not let her rest. Another brother, Ptolemy XIV, was elevated to co-ruler. Again, she married him. Again, the ritual was performed. And again, the union was symbolic. Cleopatra held the real power. Her brother remained in the shadows until he disappeared entirely. Some believe she ordered his death to secure her son's succession. That son, Caesarion, was born of Julius Caesar. And yet, even he could not escape the weight of the blood he inherited. Caesarion was a child born at the crossroads of two worlds. His mother was the final queen of a dying line. His father, at least in name, was the most powerful man in Rome. His birth was a moment of hope and danger. To the Ptolemaic court, he was a miracle, a new generation, a possible escape from the spiral. But to Rome, he was a threat, a rival heir, a child who could one day claim what others had bled to control. Cleopatra raised him not only as her son, but as a symbol. He was declared co-ruler while still a boy. She placed him beside her in rituals. She had his image struck on coins. His full name, Ptolemy XV Philopator, Philometor Caesar, was a fusion of Egyptian reverence and Roman ambition. But behind the gold and ceremony, the truth remained. Caesarion carried the same bloodline, the same legacy of closed unions, the same potential for brilliance and for ruin. By now, Cleopatra had ruled for over a decade. She had rebuilt alliances. She had stabilized Egypt's economy. She had survived palace coups, Roman politics, and civil unrest. But no ruler survives history alone. Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome. Cleopatra turned to Mark Antony. Their alliance was personal, political, and deeply strategic. With him, she had 3 more children. With him, she dreamed not only of surviving Rome, but of shaping it. Together, they imagined an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Aegean. But Rome was not blind, nor was it forgiving. Their vision was seen as betrayal. Octavian, the adopted son of Caesar, declared war. Not just on Antony, but on Cleopatra. The Queen of Egypt became the enemy of Rome. As war approached, Cleopatra fortified her fleet. She prepared her capital. She performed ancient rites meant to summon the favor of gods long silent. But she must have known. The blood in her veins was not just royal. It was stained by centuries of isolation. The dynasty she ruled was not reborn. It was unraveling for the final time. After the defeat at Actium, the dream began to die. Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra followed him not with grief, but with ritual. She dressed as Isis. She lay on her golden bed, and she chose her own end. The method remains debated. A serpent, a poison, a blade. But the meaning is clear. She ended what her ancestors had begun. Cleopatra was not merely the last ruler of her line. She was its final expression. Everything the Ptolemaic dynasty had become lived within her. The intellect, the charisma, the isolation, the genetic weight. She did not escape the pattern. She embodied it. And then, with a final breath, she broke it. When the Roman soldiers found her lifeless body, the dynasty was over. Egypt would never again be ruled by a native queen. Caesarion was captured and executed shortly after. The bloodline, so fiercely protected, so obsessively preserved, vanished in silence. Cleopatra remains a figure of legend. She has been called seductress, strategist, goddess, and martyr, but rarely is she remembered as what she truly was. The last note in a song that had been playing for 300 years. A song written not with words, but with blood. She did not choose her inheritance, but she chose how it ended. The dynasty that once cloaked itself in sacred blood had run out of purity. And Cleopatra, its final sovereign, knew this. She understood that the power sealed within her family's veins had become poison. She saw the cost of centuries spent folding the same names into new generations. But she did not surrender to it. She turned outward. She reached for the only salvation left to a throne built on repetition. She reached for Rome. The Ptolemies had married siblings to keep the throne closed. Cleopatra opened the doors, not through diplomacy alone, but through force of presence. When she met Julius Caesar, she did not come as a supplicant. She came as a storm. Political exiles rarely rewrite history. But she did, and she did so without drawing a sword. Her relationship with Caesar has been distorted by centuries of myth. To call it seduction is to ignore its substance. Cleopatra was not a courtesan. She was a queen fighting to reclaim her crown. She needed Rome to recognize her rule. Caesar needed Egypt's grain, its ports, and the image of a ruler who mirrored his ambition. Together, they formed a pact of survival. When Cleopatra returned to power in Alexandria, she did so not only with Caesar's legions, but with his legitimacy. Her brother had drowned, fleeing the chaos. The civil war was over. She stood alone on the throne, but not truly alone. She carried Caesar's child. She named him Caesarion, and she raised him to become more than an heir. She raised him to become a bridge between two empires. But even this alliance was not enough. Caesar was murdered in the Senate. The Republic fell into fire. Cleopatra turned to Mark Antony, another Roman titan. Their union was immediate, strategic. The East offered him wealth. The West offered her recognition. Together, they imagined not a future within Rome, but a world beside it. Their relationship became legend, but legend often distorts the details. Cleopatra did not abandon Egypt. She did not submit to Rome. She governed, even while love or alliance bloomed beside her. She issued decrees. She balanced trade. She commissioned temples. Her rule was firm, deliberate, and deeply rooted in both Greek reason and Egyptian ritual. She was not drifting in romance. She was steering through disaster. Mark Antony, once the Lion of Rome, was also desperate. He needed gold. He needed ships. He needed a future beyond the reach of Octavian, Caesar's heir in name but not in blood. Cleopatra offered him all of that, and more. She offered him a vision, a family. She bore him 3 children, twins first, then a third. They were not heirs to a single kingdom. They were heirs to an idea that the East could rise again. But the West refused to forget. Rome was not built on forgiveness. Octavian watched from across the sea. He read every proclamation. He heard every rumor. When Antony gave Cleopatra territories once ruled by Rome, when Caesarion was declared son of a god and king of kings, the red line was crossed. War was not a question. It was a certainty. Octavian declared war not on Mark Antony, but on Cleopatra herself. It was a calculated move. To attack a Roman citizen was treason. To attack a foreign queen was strategy. He painted her as the corrupter of Roman virtue, a temptress from the East who had bewitched Antony and stolen the legacy of Caesar. Rome responded with fury. Armies were raised. Fleets were built. And the final battle between old blood and new power began to take shape. Cleopatra prepared as she always had, not with panic, but with precision. She fortified her harbors. She called upon her allies. She reinforced her image as a divine ruler. But she must have known that this war was different. It was not just about land. It was about symbols. And she, more than any other figure alive, embodied what Rome feared. A queen who ruled alone. A woman who bore Caesar's son. A dynasty that refused to die quietly. At Actium, her fleet faced Octavian's in the blue waters of the Ionian Sea. The battle was brutal and disorienting. As fire spread across the ships and chaos took hold, Cleopatra made her decision. She withdrew. Some say it was fear. Others say it was part of a plan. Regardless, Antony followed her retreat. The battle was lost, and with it, the dream they had built began to collapse. In the months that followed, Antony's forces dwindled. His alliances broke. He returned to Egypt, a man defeated not only by Rome, but by time. Cleopatra stood beside him still, but the foundation beneath them was crumbling. They were no longer rulers of two great powers. They were survivors trapped in the echo of something that had once been invincible. Cleopatra turned again to her oldest weapon: legacy. She declared Caesarion as her sole co-ruler. She hoped that his lineage, the blood of Caesar and the house of Ptolemy, would protect him. But Octavian was not blinded by names. He was building an empire, and empires do not share. As Octavian advanced on Alexandria, the final chapter began to write itself. Antony, misled by false news of Cleopatra's death, fell upon his own sword. Cleopatra, surrounded by her most loyal servants, retreated into her mausoleum. She gathered her treasures, her records, and her final rites. She would not be taken. She would not be paraded through Rome like a trophy. What remained was choice, and she made it. But the story does not end with her death. Caesarion was captured soon after. Despite initial promises, he was executed. The line was broken. Not with glory, not with ceremony, but with silence. Cleopatra's reign was not a failure. It was a resistance. She used everything available to her: language, ceremony, intelligence, beauty. She did not inherit a kingdom. She inherited a collapsing world and held it together longer than anyone expected. Yet even she could not undo what had been done for centuries. The bloodline had turned inward for too long. Its walls had become its grave. The marriages meant to protect the throne had weakened it. The rituals meant to preserve divinity had drained the very life they sought to sanctify. Cleopatra did not escape that legacy, but she rose above it, even as it pulled her under. The halls of Alexandria grew quiet. The torches were extinguished. The royal seal of the Ptolemies, once carved into stone and pressed onto papyrus, became nothing more than a memory buried beneath layers of dust. No royal burial was given. No monument was raised. Cleopatra's tomb was never found. The Nile, which had carried the stories of kings and gods, flowed on without her name carved into its banks. But the silence was never empty. Rome claimed Egypt. Octavian returned in triumph. He brought gold, grain, and statues, but not the queen. She remained where she had fallen, shrouded in secrecy. A woman erased from life, but never from imagination. What could not be paraded was instead painted, sculpted, feared, desired, condemned. The West wrote poems of her beauty. The East remembered her language. Historians fought over her motives. Artists remade her image with each generation. Cleopatra had ruled, had bled, had burned, but she had never broken. She stood as the final mirror of a world that once believed power could be contained in blood, that gods could be born from brother and sister, that the body of a queen could carry a kingdom through her veins, that to keep the crown from slipping, one only had to lock the doors tighter. Her ancestors had married themselves into extinction. Cleopatra inherited their brilliance, their madness, their loneliness, and in the end, their fate. But she also did something no one before her had done. She ended it. With her death, the pattern shattered. The dynasty collapsed not in rebellion, but in choice. She chose not to run. She chose not to kneel. She chose not to become the final humiliation of a crumbling line. She became its last flame. And in doing so, she became something far more enduring than a ruler. She became a warning. because power drawn only from blood will always rot. Thrones guarded too closely will collapse from within, and those who wrap themselves too tightly in purity will one day suffocate. History remembers Cleopatra for her lovers, for her death, for her beauty. But perhaps it is time to remember her for something else, for being the last breath of a dynasty that dared to declare itself divine, and for being the one who, in the end, broke the curse not with a rebellion, but with a refusal. No empire ends with a single death. It ends when its story no longer belongs to itself. The Ptolemies tried to preserve their legacy by marrying it into a cage. Cleopatra opened that cage, stepped outside, and faced the storm without flinching. You have now walked through 300 years of ambition, obsession, and decay. You have seen how a dynasty built on sacred blood collapsed under the weight of its own design. You have seen how one woman rose at the end of it all, not to escape the fire, but to burn with it. And if stories like this still haunt you, if you still wonder what else history has chosen to forget, you are not alone. Because here, at the torture throne, we dig up the bones they buried too deep. We tell the truths sealed behind palace walls. We follow the bloodstains they tried to scrub from memory. If you are still watching, then stay with us. There are more crowns to uncover, more ghosts to name, and more truths to unearth from the silence.